All right, looking at question number 13, it says, at what point does a temptation become sin? Are temptations sins in themselves, or do our actions make it a sin, like a lesser sin or a greater sin? Are we all just in sin? Okay? So here it is. At what point does really a temptation become sin? Is it just simply temptations are always sins, or temptations lesser sins, greater sins? First of all, we need to understand that temptations are not themselves sin.
Because Jesus was tempted, he never sinned.
There you go. So you go back to the book of Hebrews chapter 4 and verse number 15. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse number 15. Paul, you and I are just right on the same wavelength here. So in Hebrews chapter 4 in verse number 15 it says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. And so here's Jesus Christ, and Jesus has been tempted at every single way just the same as you and I. You know? And so by living a life on this earth in his earthly body, Jesus knew exactly what it was like to be tired. Jesus knew exactly what it was like to be hungry. Jesus knew exactly what it was like to be hot or cold or anything else. And so, you know, the hangry and the irritability and everything like this. Okay. Now, Jesus knew all that stuff. I mean, Jesus knew what it was like and what it felt like to be tempted in every point just the same as we are. But here's the key difference. Jesus was without sin. So, if Jesus could be tempted, but Jesus didn't sin, what does that tell you about, is temptation sin? Temptation isn't sin. Because if temptation was a sin, then Jesus would have sinned when he was tempted in all points just like we are.
You have to act on it, right?
Exactly. So now let's go back to the book of James chapter 1. In verse number, as we looked at verse number 14, each one's tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. But then look at verse number 15. It says, then after desire conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And so here we've got, you know, kind of going back to our little guy here, we've got that urging, if you will, to go down the path of sin. And there is the temptation. All right? So when we actually go down that path and arrive, there is the sin. In other words, when we actually start to put it into practice, right? Okay? All right. Then we start to get into sins of the heart. Not sins of the action, but sins of the heart. How does that work out? Go and take a look at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 and in verse number 27. Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 27. It says, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay? And so here we've got something that is a sin, and the Pharisees are looking at this in terms of action. Right? So, as long as I don't commit an action, I therefore don't sin. All right? So, therefore, I can get as close to this action as I possibly can. And as long as I don't touch that action, then I don't sin. And I can do it as many times as I want. Right? Okay. As long as we don't touch it, we're okay. Jesus is saying, no way. Okay? Instead, where he says there, but I tell you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully, in the Greek language, this is described as a continual action. You know, it's not just simply, oh, wait a minute, I don't need to look at that. It's, oh, yeah, okay. I mean, it is the continual action type thing, okay? And it's, you know, when you start to look at it that way, Jesus is saying that the adultery has already been committed in the heart, and the type of righteousness that God really wants is not just simply an external action-based righteousness, but a righteousness of the heart, okay? And so when we look at our question and temptation again, you know, at what point does temptation become sin? There is a little bit of a gray area there, right? You know, and it's kind of like we've got to realize, hey, first of all, we need to stay away from the action itself. But at the same time, when we find ourselves being drawn in a pull to it to the degree that we want it and we want to have it, and we start to, you know, sin in the heart, so to speak, that's where we need to start reversing course and going back the other way. All right. One phrase or saying that I picked up a while ago kind of makes a lot of sense is that, you know, a guy compared temptations to birds in the tree. You know, the birds are always going to get into the tree. You just don't want them to roost. Okay? You don't want them to stay there. And so when the birds start to get in the tree, chase the birds out. Don't let them roost in there. And, you know, is there a lesser sin or a greater sin? Yeah, I mean, if you stop and think about it, practically speaking, there is. When you think about it in an absolute sense, there isn't, because, you know, sins of the heart count every much of weight as sins of actions do. And that's what Jesus was saying here in the next part of the verse. And that is, if your right hand causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away from you. It's better to lose one part of your body than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of the body than for the whole body to go into hell. That's a hyperbole. Jesus is not really talking about self-mutilation, because blind people can still lust. People who are, you know, amputees, they can still steal. Okay? That's not what he's talking about. Absolutely speaking, sins of the heart are equal to sins of the body, sins of the action. But when you think about it in just a practical sense, you know, there is a difference. And if you don't believe me, then which would you rather me do? Hate your guts and wish you dead, or pull out a gun and shoot you? Not that I do either. But I'm just saying, you know, for me, I'd rather somebody hate my guts and wish me dead than pull out a gun and try to kill me. Okay? And so when you look at it in that regard, you can see, yeah, you know what? There are some sins that really carry more weight than other sins. But as far as God goes, and especially when you think about righteousness before God, then, you know, all sin is sin. Okay? And at the same time, we need to realize that we're always in the flesh, in this life, in this body. And so because of that, we're always going to have temptations. We're always going to be drawn into things. Sometimes we're going to be successful with things. Sometimes we're not going to be successful with things. Sometimes we're going to be pulled into it and we have actions. Sometimes we're going to be able to stop and go, wait a minute, and stop, you know. And so, you know, upon that note, remember, going back to that very first verse that we looked at, we've got a great high priest who is not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses because he's been there, he's experienced it, except he was without sin. And so that next verse, verse number 16, says, let us therefore come before the throne of grace boldly to find grace and mercy to help us in our time of need. Okay? All right. Anybody got any questions on that? Yes, sir.
What is meant by the birds roosting?
Oh, when a bird roosts, it means that it gets in the tree and it nests there. It stays there. Okay? When I used to live in Corning, Arkansas, we'd have these, the blackbirds. I mean, we have them here too. But man, they would come and there'd just be a whole flock of them that would get into a tree, you know, and you get out there and you're making a bunch of noise and you try to get them out of the tree because man, once they got into the tree and they stayed overnight there, they're coming back and pretty soon you got a mess on the ground, you know, and so that's what it's, you know, the same as far as temptations go, is that, you know, you're going to have things that come into your mind and, you know, into your heart. And, you know, there's sometimes everything's going great. Have you ever experienced that? Everything's going great. Everything's wonderful. Man, you're just, you know, just spiritual life is wonderful. And then all of a sudden, it's like something just hits you. And you're like, where did that come from? You know, where did that thought come into play?
Especially when you think about, oh, I am so spiritual. I just doing good. I prayed and I really, and then something really hit you. You're, oh my goodness, I feel again, you know. And it teaches you, stay, you know.
Right.
Trust God and don't be like, oh, I'm so good and I went through this and I prayed and I read the Bible and then boom. You know?
There you go. Right.
It's kind of humble when you hit and go back to the dust.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Was there a comment over on this side? Oh, I thought I heard somebody coming over here. No? Okay.
So Steve,
What's that?
so if somebody driving down the road with a brand new Corvette, I can only look at that one time, right?
Well, you can look at it a couple of times thinking, man, that's a really nice Corvette. But when you start, well, I mean, you can look at it in a, you know, if you can appreciate, you know, the car, but when you start to covet and you want it yourself, then that's a problem right there.
If I go down
Okay.
to the dealership right after I saw that, that's a problem.
Oh, it could be. Depends on how big of an offer deal they're going to give you. Okay. All right. Anybody else got anything on that one?